Welcome, everybody. Back with another New Earth announcement. I was really getting pinged to do this video of what has been like coming through for me in the past like week or so very strongly. And so the message that I feel that Mom wanted me to share was that in the last video, I talked about how New Earth is here, right? And New Earth is already here. It's just our level of perception that is able to see that. And that the more that we, especially the first wavers, start to focus on New Earth, the more that it starts to come into physical manifestation and to start actually embodying the energy of New Earth. And so when we're talking about New Earth manifesting, I think we can really look at the myth of, or the mythical story of Adam and Eve, right? So if we are looking at this on a planetary ascension level, essentially what's happening is that humanity is returning to the Garden of Eden, right? And that mythological story was basically just telling us about how humanity became separate from Source, because that is what has occurred on the planet, and why we are in this state of amnesia and illusion that we are in. It all stems from the original separation. And every human being has this wound of separation. And that is what we're healing. So we're going back to the original wound of being separate from God and feeling, kicked out of the Garden of Eden, kicked out of creation, basically. And so we're now returning to the true Garden of Eden. And what we're really doing is we are, I talked about how we are healing the masculine and feminine rift. The damage that has been done between masculine and feminine is what has kept us, from being able to anchor in balanced harmonics. And balanced harmonics is having the divine balance within of masculine and feminine energy. So for feminine, that is 51% feminine and 49% masculine. And that is the yin energy. And for masculine, it's 51% masculine and 49% feminine, and that is the yang energy. And that is why yin and yang are the perfect combination. And that is why we say when we're returning to heaven on earth and we're returning to a feminine paradigm, what we mean by that is we're returning to leading with the feminine energy. We're leading with the heart-based energy. And that is how we're going to come back together and ultimately heal this original wound of separation. So I think we've been going through a lot of the inner healing of masculine, feminine energies. And what we're seeing in the collective is kind of the physical manifestation of this kind of battle between masculine and feminine coming to the surface, to be seen and to be healed. But we have to also return to the true source, because the only way that you can really enter heaven on earth, and the only way that you can return to the true Garden of Eden, which is balanced harmonics, which is love based, which is 5D based, where you live in harmony, where you have peace, where you have cooperation, where you have all of the divinity. In order to return to that, you have to connect to the true source, right? And so I think that what we're going to see in the next maybe coming weeks is we're going to start seeing the collapse of course, we're seeing the collapse of the patriarchal paradigm. And we're also going to start seeing the collapse of religious dogma, because religion has been pretty much the greatest assault on human consciousness, besides, what they did in terms of manipulating our DNA and manipulating our consciousness. At the root of that, at the root of the manipulation, was the fact that they inserted the ego-programmed mind, right? We know this. They inserted the ego-programmed mind into the collective consciousness to keep us in amnesia, to keep us separate, to keep us in lower states of being. And then the next part that they had to do in order to keep us in this lower state, because you have to think about it in that there was always going to be the chance that you would wake up, right? In every lifetime that we've all come here, there was always the chance that humans were going to remember the truth of who they are and the truth and the true history, and they're going to start remembering. And so in order to prevent us from ever remembering, they had to not only implant the ego-programmed mind, but they had to also create such a seed and implant such a seed of illusion into our consciousness and into our belief systems that we would never be able to fully awaken. And that's what we're kind of seeing now, is that there's a lot of people who have awakened to certain things, right? They've awakened to disclosure. They've maybe awakened to the fact that we are obviously not living life in the way that it was intended for us to live, that we need to have more harmony, we need to have more communication, we need to have balance, we need to have tolerance, we need to have compassion, we need to have kindness, all of these things. But that will only take you so far, right? Because you still have to unlock the final piece of the puzzle, what you would call the Holy Grail. You have to unlock that final piece that really brings you to heaven on earth, and that really brings you back to the place of full consciousness. And that missing piece is the true source. And the true source has been hidden from us for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So this takes a lot of unpacking. But that is why Mom came, was to plant in the consciousness the true source energy. So basically what's happened is the idea of God and the idea of source has been so heavily manipulated purposely to keep us from ever finding the true source. So I kind of liken it to, like, let's say, for your whole life, you have been, let's say you have an electronic, right? And your whole life you've been charging this electronic by plugging it into this certain plug, right? And you notice that this device, let's just say it's a phone, whatever. And you plug it in and you notice that it takes a really long time to charge up, and maybe it never even gets past 50% charge. And we just come to accept that as normal, right? So if everybody was always charging their phone and it just never gets past 50%, it just doesn't. There's not enough charge. And we just start to accept that as normal. We just start to say, oh, well, that's just the way things are. That's just the way it is. But then one day, someone figures out that there's actually a plug that you can plug your phone into where it gets up to 100%. It charges up to 100. That's essentially what is happening. Because you have to connect to the true source in order to get to that 100%, in order to get to full consciousness, in order to get the whole, pure whole truth, and in order to really embody your higher self and open the gate and be that bridge for full 5D energy to come in, you have to be at 100%. And so what's happening is that even a large amount of those who have awakened or in the spiritual community, they're still only charging to 50%, maybe 75%, but they can never get to 100, and they can't figure out why that is. And so, there's a lot of myths of what we have come to accept as normal that we're going to have to unpack as a collective. And so, of course, the number one thing is that the biggest lie ever told was that source, that the giver of life, was masculine. This has infiltrated our consciousness to such extents that I don't even know if we fully understand the ramifications of that lie, right? Because if you look around the world and why we are in the predicament that we are currently facing with kind of the collapse of the old and the spiritual battle that has taken place, it all comes down to this, because that myth has infiltrated all parts of our world. That patriarchal lie has affected the way we operate as human beings. It has led to violence and destruction and lies and separation. And ultimately, that's why we cannot heal our collective wound of separation. We cannot recommune with Source and our galactic brothers and sisters if we don't have the missing piece. Because remember, they're tapped into the true Source energy. We cannot be a part of the galactic community if we don't have the connection to the true Source. We're still living outside of the rest of creation, which is why the galactics cannot just come down. We're not a vibrational match because we are living outside of true reality. We are living outside of creation. And so that myth, and I hear, of course, we have been sharing this for years now, that the true energy of Source is feminine. And I just wanted to go through kind of the busting the myths and the things that I've heard so much people say and how they refute this, right? And I think that the first one, they say that, you can't gender God. And I find that very interesting. That's usually people's first reactions. And I always say, well, that's a very interesting thing to say because we, for the past, I don't know, think 5,000 years now, we have gendered God as a male, right? All the major religions of the world are based on the idea that the one true God is male. So why all of a sudden, when you say, well, it's actually the opposite, the argument comes up, don't gender God. And I think that represents how much resistance and how much hatred we have towards the feminine energy. That has been the brainwashing of the fact that we have accepted as a collective for over 5,000 years. And I'm just going back to when the Old Testament was said to have been written, was, like 2000 BC. So we have had this collective kind of understanding that God was a male. And as soon as you flip the script, then the argument comes, you can't gender God, but you've been gendering God. So if we cannot look at this critically and say, this is how much hatred we have towards feminine, I don't know how we're going to rise to full consciousness if we cannot see the cognitive dissonance of this. I also hear a lot people then say, that God is both masculine and feminine, which is true, of course. But they kind of depersonalize God and they say God is just an energy. It's not an actual being, right? It's just an energy. It's just the universe. And so again, that is a root of the belief system that God is male. And I'll tell you why. Because the yang energy, the masculine energy, is external. It is external. That's how yang energy represents. So for so long, we have believed that God is not only a male, but that it is external from us, that it is an external force. And we have not accepted that we are actually one and the same as God, right? That we are the same energy. We are God with God. But it also goes to the fact that they've depersonalized God and they want it to be this abstract energy that nobody can really harness and that nobody can tap into. And they don't want it to represent an actual being because that becomes too personal. Because if God is an actual being, then it brings up all of this fear that religion has placed into the consciousness, that there is this God that is sitting there raining down punishment and wrath. And I think a lot of the spiritual community, because they still have that fear of God, which was again implanted by the church, they want to run away from that by now depersonalizing God and making it this very abstract energy. It's like having God be in theory, but not in practicality, not an understanding that we are God too, that literally the God energy exists within, and that God is also a being, right? So in the beginning of creation, the only energies in existence were love and the unknown. That's source energy. Love and the unknown is source energy. But we also know that source, as a divinely intelligent energy, had to create a self-aware representation of itself, right? In order to create things. It would be completely boring if the universe was just made up of energy and there was no actual beings as expressions of source to create things and interact and travel and create like it would just be an empty universe. So source created a self-aware representation of itself, and that first self-aware representation was mother of all creation. The feminine essence had to be birthed first. She then birthed father of creation as her equal counterpart, which was a representation of her inner masculine energy, so that there was perfect balance within the universe. So I think that people get really triggered by this idea of God being a feminine, as meaning that we are now trying to cut out masculine. And again, that is just a product of brainwashing, because that's what humanity did for thousands of years. They said God was only a male and there was no feminine essence. And so what they're really expressing is this fear that we are going to eradicate the masculine now in the same way they eradicated us. Lucky for them, source is unconditionally loving, and there is no way that you can eradicate the masculine essence. So no one is saying that there is not a father of creation essence. What we are saying, though, is that the true source is the mother. It is the feminine. And you cannot separate them, but you also have to acknowledge the true source. Because without doing so, you can never unlock full consciousness. You can never arrive at the pure whole truth. You will continue to live in half truth. And that kind of takes us to the depersonalization of God as well, and that a lot of people believe that God would never come into a human form. Why? Why? Again, is that the product of the myth of the Sky Daddy? Because even when they manipulated the entire story of Jesus, they still tried to label Jesus as simply the son of God and not God itself. So they still depersonalized it to make us believe that God would never come down here, that God is an abstract concept, or it is simply a male sky daddy that lives in the sky and judges us and places wrath on us and wants us to be in fear of him. And it's just, you can see this kind of perfect storm that was created, and how these ideas and these belief systems have infiltrated all areas of our life. It is why we hold this idea of separation. That is the original separation that occurred, and that we must heal as a collective in order, again, to reunite not only with ourselves, our true selves, but to reunite with humanity as one, to reunite with Source, and to reunite with the galactics. We have to plug in to the original source. We have to heal that wound of separation. The other kind of very popular argument is that the Bible is somehow this very literal book that must be taken literally and must be adhered to. It's kind of funny. It's kind of the same thing as the debate about the Constitution that's going on in the United States, right? They're saying, well, this document was written hundreds of years ago and it's really no longer applicable to many things. And why don't we update it? Why don't we evolutionize it? And that's funny because, they have clung to the Bible for 2,000 years and never once questioned if maybe it's not really true. And maybe it's not actually relevant to us in this present moment of now. And the truth is that the Bible was written by men, for men, and to benefit men. And so I wanted to read some very interesting, I think, historical information that a lot of people maybe don't know, but I feel is going to start coming into the collective consciousness again, as we come to this great remembering. That's what we're really doing. We're coming back to the great remembering, to the truth. And if we can get to the truth and we can find that missing piece, the Holy Grail, that's what the Holy Grail represents. It's the missing piece of truth. Then we come into pure whole truth. We come into full consciousness. And that is what they do not want us to come to. And so I always find it fascinating that even those beings who are really adamant about disclosure and about the disclosure of truth refuse, just outwardly refuse to question their own beliefs about God. And people will say, well, God has nothing to do with this. God has everything to do with this. This ascension process, this spiritual battle that's going on is and always has been about God. It has always been about separating us from God, because the dark ones that took over this planet are not connected to God. They were made outside of Source. They are not plugged into Source. They were not created by Source. So, of course, this is about God. And people will say, well, we all have different versions of God. That is the problem, sir. That is the issue. We cannot live in a world where we say, well, you have your truth and you have your truth and you have your truth and you have your truth. And we're all allowed to have our own truths. That is true to a certain extent because we all have our own inner truth. Like, what is true for our souls? Like, what are we passionate about? What is our purpose? What are we really, what are we inspired by? Those are personal truths. But until we get on the same page and we are all on the same page of the pure whole truth, what will happen is we will continue to have different collectives of beings manifesting different realities. And that is what's actually has been occurring, is that we have all of these different collectives believing in a different truth. And so that truth and belief system that they have about that truth is creating their own version of reality. So what you have is probably thousands, if not millions, of competing realities that are being created through the mind. And that is why we are not on a cohesive page as one collective. That's why humanity cannot come into oneness, because we have all these different truths. And there's only one truth, right? And I think that if we can get to the heart of the last missing piece, the true missing piece, the Holy Grail of truth, if we can unlock that as a collective, all other illusionary mistruths will dissolve, right? Because all the other illusionary truths are built off the back of the original lie. And that original lie was that God was male, that God was only male, and that the giver of life was male. It goes against everything we know to be true on a practical level. It violates philosophy. It violates science. It violates what we know in our heart is true. But somehow we've just come to accept this. And that is why humanity is living in the deepest cognitive dissonance. And they can't seem to reconcile it because that original lie has created all other lies. And I've talked about this book many times before, When God Was a Woman, written by Merlin Stone. And this book, there's many others, but this book is one of the greatest pieces of literature of all time, because what Merlin Stone did was basically dedicated her life to looking at the archaeological and historical facts that tell us that the stories that we have been told about history, and the stories that we have been told specifically by the church and all the major world religions, are actually contrary to the real history. And the real history is that before the Bible and the creation of the Bible, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years prior to, most of the world's civilizations lived in societies and civilizations that honored the goddess and the mother as source, as the god. And they just rewrote it out of history. And they just took it all away and said, the Bible is what we're going to follow now. And nobody has questioned it. And nobody has actually looked and said, well, you know what? This actually doesn't make sense. And so the historical evidence tells us that there was a very strategic plan to write the feminine out of history, and to specifically write the mother god out of history, and to implant the male god into the consciousness. And this later led, right, to the Holy Wars, to the Christian Crusades. They were dominating goddess civilizations by brute barbarian force, shoving the male god down their throats and basically saying, if you don't worship the male god, we're going to destroy you and all of your cities. And my question is for those people who cling so heavily to the Bible, is that if you believe in a certain god or deity, right, and you believe it to be true, why would you need to force others to believe in it? Because the truth should stand on its own. The truth doesn't need to convince others, and it certainly doesn't need to persecute or dominate others into its belief, because the truth stands on its own, always. So nobody has sat and questioned, why was the male god shoved down our throats to the point where it wasn't even an option to deny it, people were being basically genocided if they did not agree. And I'm going to read excerpts from here for people who may have never read this book and have no idea of kind of a lot of the historical evidence to tell us that we in fact lived for a much longer period of time where we actually did align with the mother energies, the goddess energies. We honored the earth. We honored nature. It's only been within the last 2,000 to 5,000 years that we have really become a patriarchal planet. And you can see how much destruction has happened because of that. So she does a great job in this book. And, if you've never read it, it's a hard read a little bit. There's a lot of kind of historical facts in there, but I did just highlight a lot of portions which I felt were the most relevant and important for us to talk about. So the first one, which I thought, it's in the introduction, and this is the most fascinating piece, I think, in the book, is she writes, paying closer attention to semantics, subtle linguistic undertones and shades of meaning, I noticed that the word cult, which has the implicit connotation of something less fine or civilized than religion, was nearly always applied to the worship of the female deities, not by ministers of the church, but presumably objective archaeologists and historians. So what she's saying is that throughout all of the research that historians and archaeologists have done, they started labeling any historical civilization that worshipped a goddess as a cult. For obvious reasons, that's very funny, right? And where that term actually comes from and why they used it. And they also used it to basically deter anybody from going outside of the established religions. That's what the word originally meant. So funny for very obvious reasons. She says the priestesses of the goddess, so many of these cultures not only had and honored some sort of female goddess, and they had different names, all across different civilizations. And then there was always priestesses. Many of you have heard of high priestesses, also known as oracles, right? And she says they provided the counsel and advice at her shrines of prophetic wisdom, and they were described as being fit for this position, since as women they were more intuitive or emotional, and thus they were ideal mediums for divine revelation. So this was very common, that there were priestesses, also known as the high priestesses or the oracles, who were basically the vessels of receiving divine guidance from the mother and counseling. And we'll get into that a little bit more in this book, but to counsel kings, to counsel politicians, to counsel entire communities by basically being able to receive the divine information. And she goes on to say, strangely enough, emotional qualities or intuitive powers were never mentioned in connection with the male prophets. So all the male prophets that the Bible glorifies, they never talk about them being intuitive. They never talk about them having any sort of spiritual powers. They always talk about them as if they just, like I briefly know like the stories of Abraham and Moses, and it was always God came to them in a very physical way. He came and said, here's the 10 commandments. And what's funny about that is because notoriously the masculine have not had the same level of intuitive connection as the feminine. So when they wrote these stories, they completely wrote out any idea of having intuition or spiritual connection. And instead they were just prophets because the messages fell from the sky into their lap and they were chosen as a prophet. And that's interesting in so many ways. Now she goes on to talk about the different historical evidences of civilizations that honored the goddess. And of course, there was many, many different names. She said even more astonishing, and she's right now referring to many of the biblical passages where they describe a feminine name. This one she's specifically talking about was Ashtoreth, which I believe is mentioned in the Bible and in many other documentations. And she says, even more astonishing was the archaeological evidence which proved that her religion had existed and flourished in the Near and Middle East for thousands of years before the arrival of the patriarchal Abraham, the first prophet of the male deity Yahweh. So this myth that we've always worshipped Sky Daddy is just, it's just not true. It's just categorically false. And the fact that most people have no idea that this is just not true and don't question where this narrative comes from also says that their brainwashing was very successful. She said that archaeologists have traced the worship of the goddess back to the Neolithic communities of about 7,000 BC. Some to the upper Paleolithic cultures of about 25,000 BC. So if we look at 25,000 BC, and I'm not sure when this book was written, 1976, a year after Mom Incarnated. So that takes us back to the times of Atlantis and Lemuria. So even after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria, where the population was, of course, we were reverted into an amnesia state and we were taken over by the dark, and they started implanting the ego. Even with that, we still have 25,000 years of historical evidence that says we were still honoring the mother. We were still honoring the goddess energy, which tells me that the reason that they had to, at the point of Mom coming in as Jesus, I think that at that point they decided, okay, for the last 25,000 years, we've been able to separate humanity as much as we can. We've kept them in a lower state of consciousness, but they are still connecting to source, right? So we have to do something pretty drastic in order to separate them from her so that we can have total domination on this planet, because these humans just keep, they're connecting to the source, and we're not going to be able to sustain this power. We're not going to be able to take over the way that we originally wanted to unless we do something very drastic. And then she goes on to say that in the most ancient human societies, people probably did not yet possess the conscious understanding of the relationship of sex to reproduction. Thus, the concepts of paternity and fatherhood would not yet have been understood. If this was the case, then the mother would have been seen as the singular parent of her family, the lone producer of the next generation. For this reason, it would be natural for children to take the name of their mother's tribe or clan. So what she's saying is that back in those days, of course, they don't have DNA testing. They hadn't yet developed science. And so these more primitive civilizations didn't have the understanding yet of how reproduction worked. They just knew that feminine would birth life, but they hadn't necessarily made that connection of the fact that sex led to reproduction, right? Because again, in those days that you don't have the same understanding. So this is the basis of what she goes on to talk about, of how the mother was always who passed on her name and her tribe. Things like real estate, abundance, resources were always passed down through the mother line, because they didn't yet know how to establish paternity. The paternal figures were just men of the community that took care of the whole as a tribe. But there was no specific understanding of who's the father of this child, who's the father of this child, right? So everything was passed down through the mother, which makes a lot of sense when we think about the fact that the patriarchy in the last 2,000 years flipped everything so that now both woman and child must take on the name of the male, because that is how they decided that they could maintain power, is if they were the ones to pass down wealth, real estate, noble titles. It could no longer pass through the feminine because they can't control them. They can't get power. So it brings us to some more interesting findings. So She says, so here she is quoting a man named W. Schmidt. And he wrote, W. Schmidt, quoted by Joseph Campbell in the book Primitive Mythology, states of these early cultures. Here it was the women who showed themselves supreme. They were not only the bearers of children, but also the chief producers of food. Again, this kind of goes back to culturally. We can look at women notoriously were more the ones who were doing the gardening and the planting and the cooking and things like that. So I feel it's what she's referring to. By realizing that it was possible to cultivate as well as to gather, they had made the earth valuable, and they became consequently its possessors. Thus, they won both economic and social power and prestige. An author named Hawkes in 1963 added to this commentary and said, there is every reason to suppose that under the conditions of the primary Neolithic way of life, which again goes back from 7,000 to 25,000 BC, the way of life of the mother and the clan system were still dominant, and the land would have descended through the female line. Now, we jump in time to 49 years before the birth of Christ. A man from Roman Sicily wrote of his travels in northern Africa. Some of them were near the eastern countries, and he recorded his observations of the people there. He described the civilizations, and he said all authority was vested in the woman, who discharged every kind of public duty. The men looked after domestic affairs just as the women do among ourselves, and did as they were told by their wives. They were not allowed to undertake war service, or to exercise any functions of government, or to fill any public office, such as might have given them more spirit to set themselves up against the women. The children were handed over immediately after birth to the men, who actually reared them and provided food. So that's interesting, right? And then she goes on to say that in prehistoric Egypt, the goddess held supremacy in Upper Egypt. They did worship a goddess named Nekhbet, which was symbolized as a vulture. From about 3000 BC onward, the goddess known as Nut, Net, or Nit, probably derived from this word Nekhbet, was said to have existed when nothing else had been created. She created all that came into being. So she then went on to say that she's referring to an archaeologist who said he then recorded what we today may find a most startling description of the laws of Egypt, explaining that they were the result of the reverence paid to the mighty goddess. It was ordained that the queen would have the greatest power. Sir William Flinders Petrie wrote in 1925 that in Egypt all property went in the female line. The woman was the mistress of the house, and in early tales she is represented as having entire control of herself and the place. A most enlightening and significant study on the social structures and positions of women in Egypt was done in 1949 by Dr. Margaret Murray, painstakingly tracing the lineage of royal families in Egypt. She eventually proved at the level of royalty that the Egyptian culture was matrilineal, which means that the nobility and rights to the kingdom passed on through the mother, not the father. So then we jump to, okay, now she's saying that the very fact that so many of the laws concerned women suggests that both the economic and sexual position of women was continuously changing from the time of the first northern invasions, which was around 2300 BC, until the laws of the Hebrews, which were probably written down between 1250 and 1000 BC. So what she's saying is that around 2300 BC, so 2300 years before Mom's lifetime as Jesus, they started to have invasions, and they called them the northern invasions because they obviously came from the north, and they referred to them as Indo-Europeans. And I can't read, we won't be able to cover everything in this book, but she talked about how they were referred to as Indo-Europeans, and basically they were white presenting males that began infiltrating and kind of dominating all of these ancient civilizations, right? And they were the ones who came with all of these kind of weapons and tools and basically just overtook everything. And she puts many quotes from the Bible in there and breaks down a lot of the passages where they explicitly say that they would go into these cities and basically burn it all to the ground, commit mass genocide. And that especially if anybody in the villages or these communities did not accept the male deity, they would just wipe them out. And so you started having these invasions happen. We don't know how that occurred. There is a fascinating part in this book where she actually talks about going back to the mythological story, and many of you might have read this story before that's linked to the Anunnaki, that talks about the two brothers, Enki and Enlil, right? And so that's an interesting thing to note, because whoever these Indo-Europeans were, which, I don't know if they exactly know how they formed or where they came from, but they basically began to travel south and start dominating all of these civilizations and then implanting their belief systems there. And this later birthed Christianity and birthed Judaism and birthed Islam. So we don't know what happened, but very interesting that they kind of refer to these invaders, these Indo-Europeans, as being associated with Enki and Enlil, which are associated with the Anunnaki. So she says that the goddess worship, probably accompanied by the matrilineal customs, appears to have existed without challenge for thousands of years. It is upon the appearance of the invading northerners, who from all accounts had established a patrilineal custom and the worship of a supreme male deity sometime before their arrival in these goddess worshipping areas. The greatest change in religious beliefs and social customs appears to take place. Who were these northern people? It's a good question. She said, what is most significant is that in historic times, the northern invaders viewed themselves as superior people. The Indo-Europeans were in continual conflict not only with the people whose lands they invaded, but between themselves as well. The influx of the Indo-European immigrants into the East during the second millennium revolutionized the art of war. I found that passage interesting because if we kind of relate them to what we know about the dark, is that they're always in battle amongst themselves because they all want power. So the fact that they have even acknowledged that not only were they constantly in conflict trying to invade and conquer other people, but they were constantly in conflict with themselves, which tells you kind of everything you need to know about the patriarchal mindset, right? Now she says, historical, mythological, and archaeological evidence suggest it was these northern people who brought with them the concepts of light as good and dark as evil, and of a supreme male deity. So this is interesting because it brings race a little bit into the conversation, and maybe how race and religion is actually one and the same, because these invaders were not only coming to conquer everybody and force them into this worship of a male deity, and also to then basically hand over power to men and strip feminine of all power and of all benefits that they had built up in these civilizations. But they also started injecting the notion that light was good and dark was bad. And you can see how that has spawned into incredible amounts of violence and hatred and, race discrimination. So again, just very interesting that it all kind of ties in together. Now we get to this part where she says, writing in 1965, Giuseppe Sormani also tells us that the Aryans, and so they're referring to these Indo-Europeans as Aryans, which I feel just for historical reference was the whiter presenting, looking beings, where they describe the goddess cultures and a lot of these other ancient civilizations as they were darker skinned. So he tells us that the Aryans came into contact with highly civilized and already ancient forms of settled society, in comparison with which they were mere barbarians. They had long since abandoned matriarchy and had a patriarchal family system, as well as a patriarchal form of government. So he's basically saying that the civilizations that they came and conquered that were in tune with the feminine god were highly advanced and highly civilized. They didn't have wars, and they also had built up their civilizations to be very efficient, to be very advanced for their time, and that in comparison, they were barbarians. Everything you need to know is in that sentence. It goes on to say that the male deity of Egypt, who arrived with the invaders, was portrayed as a sun god riding in his boat, much as Enki was known as he who rides. So you can see how that was tying in. So when they forced them into the worship of the male god, they portrayed it as a sun god riding in on his boat. And if you've seen those hieroglyphics that they have, they do portray them as kind of coming in. They look like boats in the sky. And so I feel what they were actually portraying was these invaders, which obviously have some link to the Anunnaki. Now she gets into kind of the historical descriptions in the Bible, right? And she's talking specifically about the Levites, because the Levites and their priest were the one who wrote the Old Testament. They were the ones that came up with the laws and wrote these stories that we now know to be the Old Testament. So she says the association of the Hebrew people and the Indo-Europeans both worshiping a god of light is even further suggested by the recent discoveries of the Old Hebrew texts popularly known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These scrolls, discovered at Qumran in Palestine, are the oldest extent of Hebrew text of the book of the Old Testament, dating from about the 3rd century BC. It is an account known as the Scroll of the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. The scroll consists of plans for a battle that was about to be fought. So that's interesting when we think about the reference where they're saying that these invaders were bringing this idea to the civilizations as well of light was good and dark was bad. So it kind of takes on this new meaning when you read, this passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls talking about the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness, and the battle of what we call darkness and light, and maybe how that also ties into this very misconstrued understanding of what this battle was. I think that they were literally telling us that they were going to be starting the battle of truth. They were going to begin the battle of separating us from source. She says, In fact, several documents and myths suggest that the Neolithic and early historic goddess-worshipping communities were governed by assemblies, probably composed of the elders of the community. Even in Hittite times, which was Bible times or prehistoric Bible times, the texts describe a group known as the elderly women who held prophetic and advisory positions and were also associated with mental and physical healing. So again, you can see how this later led to the witch hunts, the burning and persecution of women who had prophetic abilities. They have always wanted to eradicate the feminine because of their prophetic abilities, because of their connection to source, because of their intuition. And we see it today. We see it in our daily life, just very subtly. So she ends this chapter by saying, permanent hereditary kingship became the rule, and as the male deity gained supremacy, the role of the benefactor of the divine right to the throne was eventually shifted over to the men, a concept of the rights of royalty that survives today. The political position of the high priestesses presented a major obstacle to the desire of the northern conquerors for a permanent kingship and more control of the government. Okay, so this has always been about power. This has always been about power. And by eradicating Mother God, by eradicating the true source, they were able to take the power from the feminine, give it to the masculine, and basically solidify for the next 2,000 years and longer that they would be able to hold power that was never rightfully theirs. She says, the goddess was revered as the deity of love and fertility and also of sexual energy. It was very honored and sacred in these times, and today it's very taboo. We'll get to why that is. She says there was primitive symbolic magic to invoke fertility in cattle and vegetation as well as in humans. It is my opinion that they may have developed as a result of the earliest consciousness and comprehension of the relationship of sex to reproduction. In the worship of the female deity, sex and the sexual energy, the life force energy, was her gift to humanity. It was sacred and holy. Then she says, we might consider the religions of today as strange in that they seem to associate shame and even sin with the very process of conceiving human life. In early historic times, never was the question or even the concept of respectability or propriety raised. It was later invented as the new morality. The anti-sexual attitude was not the result of a more inherent purity or lesser sex drive among the adherents of the Judeo-Christian beliefs, but it was probably developed and propagated for purely political motives, aiming at goals that would allow the invading patrilineal Hebrews greater access to land and government control by destroying the ancient matrilineal system. She said, Sumerian and Babylonian documents reveal that these women, through their affiliations with the temple, owned land and other properties and engaged in extensive business activities. They were often of wealthy families and well accepted in society. They were known as sacred women. She then says, we may suspect the underlying moral stance was the political maneuvering for power over land and property accessible to them, meaning the masculine, only upon the institution of a patrilineal system, perhaps a system long known to them in the northern lands of the Indo-European. She said that the Levite priests are the ones who devised the concept of sexual morality, and that is when we take a turn. around when the Old Testament was beginning to be written, and it was written by the Levites and the Hebrews, and they were dominating all these civilizations with the idea of the male deity. And so they were noticing that all of these civilizations, of course, they were honoring the mother, and they were also honoring the feminine in the way that they were not only utilized as priestesses and prophetic deliverers of messages from the divine and counseling whole communities and politicians and rulerships on, best actions to take, how to, do certain things within the community. But they were also passing down the royalty, the noble titles of those civilizations through the mother. They were passing down land and resources in abundance through the mother line. And so in order to take power, in order for men to become kings, they had to somehow convince these cultures that the royalty lied in the man. And so how did they do that? Well, it's very interesting, because what she says is, as we talked about in the earlier times when they didn't have a full understanding of reproduction, and they didn't have paternity testing, they didn't have that understanding. So what they had to do was that these priests started to create such horrific and strict laws for women that they had to be virgins. If they were married, they became property of their husbands, and they were not allowed to engage in any sort of sexual relationships outside of their marriage. Why? Why do we see this huge shift in the understanding and celebration of sexual life force energy? Well, because then they can prove paternity. That's how they prove paternity, is by making sure that the woman is only with a single man and is the property of that man. That's how they would prove paternity. And thus, that's how they would regain control of all the resources and the power and the positions and the money and the land. So she goes on to say that statues of the female deity have been continually unearthed in archaeological excavations. These images of the goddess, some dating as far back as 7000 BC, offer the silent testimony to the most ancient worship of the Queen of Heaven in the land that is today most often remembered as the birthplace of Judaism and Christianity. And she goes on to mention how they document in the Bible that there was many civilizations that were rejecting the male deity. So she said the defection, so the rejection of Yahweh, this male deity, as described, continued throughout the biblical accounts. But a most revealing passage is in the book of Jeremiah. This incident took place in a Hebrew colony of Egypt at about 600 BC. Here the religion of the goddess and the reverence paid to her, even by the Hebrews of that time, was described not as a new religion that they had to recently adopt, but one that these Hebrews had already been following before in Jerusalem. It also strongly hints that this was a religion of women, although the Levite writers carefully depicted the husbands as having authority and exhibit an obvious insistence upon male lineage in the answers given by the worshippers of the Queen of Heaven. So what's interesting is that, of course, many people, when we have said that Jesus was in fact a woman, and they rewrote him as a male, I've heard many people say, well, that couldn't possibly be true because women back then had no social standing, and it would have been absolutely absurd that, Jesus as a woman would have gained the following that she did, would have had as much power as she did at those times. It just wouldn't have been possible. Well, now we know that that's actually not true, right? Because there were all these civilizations, even during this time period, where they were basically in resistance and rejecting this supreme male god in many of these Egyptian and Hebrew areas. And so it is not at all unimaginable that Jesus was in fact a woman, and she saw what was happening and said, okay, I'm coming in as a woman to restore the goddess energy. And that is when they took it upon themselves and said, well, obviously we're doing our best to dominate all of these civilizations. We're doing our best to basically force people to give their power to the masculine god and to men in general. But Jesus, she represented a really big threat to that agenda. And so they instituted then the second biggest lie of all time, that Jesus was a man. And that Jesus came to die for our sins, and that Jesus commands all of these things. She then goes, deeper into some of these passages from the Bible, and she says, in the Bible you can read that the laws were so severe that they commanded the members of the Hebrew religion to murder even their own children if they did not worship the male god. That should probably tell you everything that you need to know about this religion, about this dogmatic way in which we have just accepted, right? The Hebrew prophets and priests, the Levites, wrote with open and scornful contempt of any woman who was neither virgin nor married, and they insisted that all women must be publicly designated as property of some man. She said, once having invented this concept of morality, they flung accusations of immorality at women whose behavior and lives, in accordance with their most ancient beliefs, were of the highest and most sacred nature. As we have seen, despite the constant threats, Hebrew women and men alike, even their royalty, did indeed continue to worship the Queen of Heaven. In doing this, they were symbolized by the priests as daughters of Zion, and as this daughter was denounced as unfaithful. She goes on to say, upon reading the Levite laws, it becomes apparent that the sexual autonomy of women in the religion of the goddess posed a continual threat. It undermined the far-reaching goals of the men, perhaps led or influenced by Indo-European peoples who viewed women as property and aimed at a society in which male kinship was the rule. The civilizations that worshipped the goddess, which had flourished for thousands of years, bringing with them inventions of agriculture, medicine, architecture, wheeled vehicles, ceramics, textiles, and written language, were gradually stamped out. Though the Indo-Europeans had initiated a great many change, it was later the duty of every Hebrew and then of every Christian to suppress and destroy the worship of the female deity wherever it still existed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what led to the Holy Wars. Because if you look at the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they all agree on just one thing. Women are lesser. Women are not equal. There is no feminine god. So they don't agree on anything else. And they have fought so many wars of killing in the name of their own god, right? So they don't agree on anything except that women are less, that women are property. And that's very interesting because we still have this continuing today. Now, we do have some evidence where she talks about how they associated the serpent with the goddess in many ancient cultures. We know that because Mom has also shared that she is Ophiuchus, which is the serpent or the dragon. And this later leads us into the mythological story of Adam and Eve and why they always associate the serpent with bad or dark or evil. And that is because the original serpent energy, the Kundalini energy, the life force energy, is in fact feminine. So this appears all throughout different shrines. And then she kind of mentions the Greek temples, because we know a lot about Greek mythology, right? And so she says the shrines that perhaps offer the deepest insight into the connections of the female deities of Greece to the serpent goddess of Crete is Delphi. And there's a shrine at Delphi, if any of you have ever been there. In the earliest times, the goddess at Delphi was held sacred as the one who supplied divine revelations spoken by the priestesses who served her. Sacred snakes were, kept at these temples. So you see the theme that this is not a new thing. Now, she talks about the priestesses and says, in questioning the nature and purpose of the oracle shrines and the priestesses who gave advice, historical records, especially in Babylon and Greece, explain that they were primarily utilized for political, governmental, and military matters. The idea was that these women were understood to be in direct communication with the deity who possessed the wisdom of the universe. And why is it now that the church replaced that with priests and priests only, and women are not allowed to be in the church? Well, for this exact reason. To cut the feminine out so that you will never connect to the true source. So I'll end with where she breaks down the myth of Adam and Eve, and how part of the wound of separation also stems from this allegorical story, which was written by men, to plant in the minds of feminine the idea of the original sin. The original sin is that Eve, the woman, was first of all created as some sort of afterthought to the man, right? Just take a spare rib and make Eve because Adam's going to get bored. And then that she is the one seduced by the evil serpent who tells her to eat from the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. So they're outwardly telling you they don't want you to have knowledge. And basically that from that day forward, women were blamed of the fall of grace. Women were blamed for the downfall of humanity as a whole. And she says, in order to achieve their position, the priests of the male deity had been forced to convince themselves and to try to convince their congregations that sex, the very means of procreating new life, was immoral and the original sin. This then was the unfortunate, unnatural, and uncomfortable trap of its own making in which the patriarchal religion fell. He says, the Levites certainly knew as well, as we are assured, that the male does not come from the female, but the female comes from the male. We may be reminded of the Indo-European Greek story of Athena being born from the head of Zeus. So what they wrote in the Bible, there's actually a specific reference where they literally say that male does not come from female, but female from male, which goes against everything we know to be true, because who birthed these men? Who birthed these men? And again, this is the biggest lie ever told, that we have allowed to infiltrate our consciousness, and this is the original wound of separation, and this original sin, this hatred of the feminine, has to be reconciled with the collective. We have to come to the full understanding that the hatred of feminine is really the root of this disaster of the planet. And, I definitely don't feel, it's not that we are meant to be returning to just, first of all, worship is a lower energy in general. There's no worship. And it's not that we are going to return to just worshiping feminine and cutting the masculine out. That's not at all what New Earth is going to be, but it will require balanced harmonics, and it will require the understanding and the honoring of the feminine energy, both within and externally, so that masculine and feminine can finally come together in harmony and in oneness, rather than having this battle internally and externally. And so we do have to come to a place of, I think, forgiveness and also understanding of the truth. And that will naturally bring in the harmony and just divine balance between masculine and feminine. Because, of course, there is both masculine and feminine aspects of God. But without honoring and respecting and acknowledging the true source, you can't really have that connection. You can't honor, you can say, I honor, masculine and feminine energy as God, but if you don't acknowledge source as the actual true source, which is feminine energy, you can't be connected to the truth of creation. You can't return to oneness without unlocking that peace. So she says, when we're talking about the myth of Adam and Eve, she says, as the Hebrew myth of creation was later adopted into the sacred literature of Christianity, along with all the other writings of the Old Testament, the writers and religious leaders who followed Christ assumed the same pose of contempt for the female, continuing to use religion to lock women into the role of passive, inferior beings, and thus more easily controlled property of men. Within the very structure of the contemporary male religion are the laws and attitudes originally designated to annihilate the female religion, female sexual autonomy, and matrilineal descent. These are the precepts that many of our own grandparents and parents accepted as the sacred and divine word of God, making them such an inherent part of family life that they now affect even those of us who have lived far removed from the masses and sacraments of organized religion. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the power and influence of the church was an even greater obstacle to the quest for female autonomy. The early feminists went so far as to compile writing a book that was called The Woman's Bible, in which the author Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "It is rather remarkable that young Hebrews should be told to honor their mothers, when the whole drift of the teaching thus far has been to throw contempt at the entire sex. In what way could they show their mothers honor? All the laws and customs forbid it. Religion, as it was known in the Western world in the 19th century, was male religion. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, though they may have differed about what sacrament to take or which day was actually the Sabbath, were in complete agreement on one subject, which was the status of women." And what she points out here when she says the young Hebrews were told to honor their mothers. How can we honor, and this is again why everyone threw so much hate and absolutely just vehemently had so much anger and resentment towards Mom and towards her stating that she is prime source creator. That hatred trickles down into every human being, the hatred for the mother, the hatred for the feminine, because you cannot teach that women are subservient and lesser than and not sacred and not holy, and that we are in fact just property, and then turn around and say, honor your mother. And this is why the resistance is so deep and so profound when we get to the final truth. When you get to this final piece of truth, everything in our ego mind wants to resist this final truth because it is so deeply embedded in us to hate the mother and to hate feminine energy. And if we can unlock this as a collective, and what the message that I have been receiving is that this final truth is going to come to the surface. This will be the final collapse of the patriarchy, and it is going to have to be absorbed into the collective consciousness, and it's something of a reckoning for humanity, for the church, which has been the biggest propagator of this lie, and what they have used it and how they have used it to manipulate and to just destroy the natural order of creation, and to just absolutely destroy the feminine, and consequently destroy the union of the masculine and feminine. And as we know, the divine unions of masculine and feminine are the most powerful thing on the planet. And that is the next step for humanity, is to come into balance within themselves, and to also come into the divine union of masculine and feminine energy, to return this planet to the Garden of Eden and to harmony. But we cannot do that if we refute the absolute truth. So this last piece of the puzzle is the full whole truth. It is the missing piece, and it is the Holy Grail. And And I feel that this information is going to come in a rush of a great remembrance that comes into our consciousness. It's not something that needs to be proven. It's not something that needs to be forced upon others. It is simply just meant to be remembered and felt. And so again, this is going to be a very big week. I did do a podcast on July 31st, which we have a triple fated conjunction happening at 18 degrees Taurus, and Taurus is holding the energies of New Earth, Mother Nature, the Divine Mother. So I think that there's going to be a very interesting turn of events in the next few weeks, and we are truly returning to the Garden of Eden state, and it just takes the courage to really dive deep into all of the resistances within our minds that want to reject that final piece, so that we can finally go back to the beginning and heal that wound of separation, to return to the true source. So I love you all. I hope that you have a great week, and I'll probably be back before the 8/8 portal because big energies are rolling in there. So I love you all, and I'll see you soon.